On the westernmost edge of the contiguous United States, wedged between two Canadian provinces, lies a place you might not have known was American Point Roberts. Its only road heading south ends abruptly at the Canada-U.S. border. The same goes for the roads to the east and west. You're trapped. To get anywhere else in the United States, you need to head north into Canada. And there are a couple of ways we ended up in this situation. But ultimately, it all boils down to a series of unfortunate events. Miscommunication, blurry maps, a failure to zoom out, and some colonial-era rules that nobody thought to update. When most people think about where the United States ends and Canada begins, they imagine a landscape that makes sense. There's the Mississippi River, which forms part of the border between the two countries. There's the Rocky Mountains, which run along the western edge of the U.S. states of Montana, Idaho, and Washington, ending just shy of the 49th parallel, which runs between Minnesota and the Pacific Ocean. The idea of having a border that follows a river or mountain range seems logical. They're natural features of the land that predate any human decision to divide it up. Rivers aren't likely to move. Mountain ranges don't suddenly shift, and they make sense to use as dividers because they reflect the physical reality of the land, rather than any sort of arbitrary line drawn across a vague map. That's probably why the Mississippi and the Rockies are used as borders between the U.S. and Canada, except they're not. The actual border doesn't follow either. The entire length of the U.S. Canada border west of Minnesota is defined by a single line, 49th parallel, which runs directly across the South Sand Peninsula, cutting the area into two pieces. The northern piece belongs to British Columbia, while the southern piece belongs to the U.S., specifically the state of Washington. The Washington portion is tiny, just under 5 square miles, and is home to about 1,300 people who live in a place called Point Roberts. Their houses sit on what's legally America, but their lives depend on getting to the rest of America, which requires them to navigate the quirks of international borders. Every time they leave their homes, residents of Point Roberts head north into Canada to reach the nearest bridge back into Washington state, necessitating a border crossing in both directions. It's strange, but it isn't unique. There are other pieces of the United States scattered throughout Alaska and the Pacific Ocean that are unconnected to the contiguous landmass. These are technically called exclaves, bits of one country completely blocked off from the rest of it. They're usually just a part of a larger, more complicated mess of divided land. But even these enclaves are simple compared to Point Roberts. There's no checkpoints or border walls. Residents are free to come and go as they please, though they do need a passport if they want to fly directly to the rest of Washington state or anywhere else in the U.S. Otherwise, they'll have to fly north into Vancouver, British Columbia, then catch a connecting flight from there. In 2021, the COVID pandemic forced Canada to close its borders to Americans. Suddenly, Point Roberts was completely cut off from the rest of the United States. Gas stations ran dry. Shelves emptied in grocery stores. Local optometrist was unable to restock on contact lenses. School kids had to be bused across the border to attend classes in Blaine, Washington, 45 minutes away. As the pandemic dragged on, supplies were eventually delivered to Point Roberts via ferry or seaplane. The American enclave had become a real-life game of SimCity, completely dependent on neighboring Canadian infrastructure for its survival. Point Roberts is an American island in a sea of Canada, and it didn't used to be. Until the mid-19th century, the entire area was a part of the British Columbia colony. But as the United States expanded westward, it set its sights on the Pacific Northwest. In the early 1800s, Britain and the U.S. were fighting over who should own Oregon Country, a vast tract of land stretching from California to the southern border of Russia, including what's today the Pacific Northwest region of the U.S. and Canada. Both countries made claims based on exploration and trading expeditions dating back to the 1700s, as well as treaties with various indigenous nations. In 1846, the two countries sat down and hammered out the dispute with the Oregon Treaty. It was a pretty clean split. The entire region would be divided along the 49th parallel. This latitude line runs roughly east-west, cutting across the continent from Minnesota to the Pacific Ocean. With that one stroke, the U.S. claimed the entire region south of the line, including Oregon, Washington, and a small slice of Idaho, while Britain kept everything north of the line, creating the border we see today. But the treaty wasn't exactly airtight. At the time, no one had detailed maps of the Pacific Northwest, They didn't have Google Maps or even the CIA World Factbook. For cartographic data, they turned to something called the Northwest Ordinance, which had established the boundaries of the Oregon Territory back in 1848. The ordinance drew the border along the 49th parallel, but it didn't define it precisely. The 49th parallel is invisible unless you're standing directly on it, so the border could theoretically be anywhere along the line. Nobody thought to ask, because at the time nobody cared. No one was living there. The first European settlers arrived in the 1850s. By then, it was too late. The 49th parallel was already being used as a boundary. Under the terms of the Oregon Treaty, the new border would be wherever the 49th parallel happened to lie. In other words, it would be up to future generations to decide where the 49th parallel actually went, which has led to complications. The 49th parallel cuts right across the Sowsun Peninsula, leaving a small American tip known as Point Roberts. But when the treaty was signed, the land was uninhabited and considered worthless. Only one family lived there, and they lived in a log cabin without even knowing the United States existed. If the border were redrawn to follow the coast, as it more or less does everywhere else, the peninsula would belong to Canada. But by then, it was too late. The border was already fixed. The U.S. owned the peninsula. By the time surveyors arrived to measure the exact location of the 49th parallel in the 1890s, they found that it fell right across the middle of the peninsula. Moving the border to account for the mistake would require redrawing the entire boundary between the United States and Canada. That seemed like an unnecessary complication. In fact, no one even noticed the error until 1921 when a British geographer pointed it out in an academic paper. By then, Point Roberts had grown to include several hundred residents, most of whom had no idea that their town was entirely surrounded by foreign territory. Today, the border remains fixed along the 49th parallel, granting Canada ownership of most of the peninsula and the United States ownership of the rest. The border was created before modern maps existed and defined by a line that was intended to be a rough approximation. Now it's a part of daily life for the people who call Point Roberts home. A quick glance at a map of the United States will reveal that the country is quite as neatly divided as you might have thought. There are islands that belong to the U.S. scattered throughout the Pacific Ocean. Territories such as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands that are owned by the U.S., but are independent from the rest of the country in enclaves regions that are completely blocked off from the rest of the country they're legally a part of. Point Roberts is one of the few remaining examples of a geopolitical oddity. The easiest way to fix the issue would be to simply change the border to follow the coast, thus transferring Point Roberts to Canada. But doing so would open up a Pandora's box of complications for both countries. Each country's legal team would need to comb through every treaty and law to ensure that nothing would break once the border moved. The Supreme Court would likely have to weigh in, and politicians on both sides would probably lose their jobs. All that work and expense for a small peninsula inhabited by fewer than 2,000 people, it doesn't seem worth it. So for the time being, Point Roberts stays American, but depends on Canada for most of its services. In the meantime, the residents of Point Roberts, Washington, keep crossing the border in all directions, always moving toward the intangible concept of home. Borders are supposed to be permanent, immutable lines drawn on maps that stay the same forever. But in reality, they're often just accidents of history. If the 49th parallel had been precisely surveyed before it was used as a border, Point Roberts would almost certainly belong to Canada today. But because it was drawn arbitrarily, we ended up with a situation that feels like it was designed by a drunk teenager with a ruler and a protractor instead of diplomats. Today, the people who call the peninsula home have learned to live with the border that cut them off. From the rest of the country they were illegally a part of, they've built their lives around 2 bridges and a handful of ferries. If you like weird geography and forgotten corners of the world, check out our video on Siberia's lost Soviet villages. Or watch this video instead.